Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our event, Center for Ideas Society, Undisciplining Study, Convivial Research Methods, Counter-Expressions, Otherwise. Looking forward to being with you. My name is Dylan Rodríguez. I'm here as the co-director for the Center for Ideas in Society. I'm also in my 21st year as a faculty member at UC Riverside. I'm in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies, formerly in Ethnic Studies. We are recording this event. A live transcription is available if you use the interface at the bottom of your Zoom. Please feel free to chime in if you have any questions about the recording. The recording will generally be posted and made public at some point after this event, as soon as our participants have an opportunity to reflect on the contents. So I want to open this occasion by honoring Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of cultivating an indigenous bodily, archival, and epistemological presence at the UC Riverside campus and beyond. The Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples are the original surviving and present human caretakers of the land, water, and air that is occupied by the University of California. The territory has never been ceded, just as indigenous sovereignty and self-determination have not been surrendered. UCR is inhabited by indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations people from all over the world, many of whom are among our faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is mere blocks away from the place where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller in 1998. A reminder that this institution and the University of California generally have a long history of proximity to and active complicity in anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. So it's with a sense of humble gratitude and urgent obligation that I ask us to confront the conditions that surround and permeate our gathering today and beyond. I look forward to continuing to work with so many of you all to decolonize this planet, this world, and to create possibilities for abolitionist and liberated, thriving thought and creativity. That is what brings us here. I want to continue by thanking the co-sponsors for this event, the Critical Anti-Violence Research and Action Working Group, CARA, three of whose folks are here. The Department of Ethnic Studies has given us some support as well. Department of Media and Cultural Studies and the Grad School of Education has thrown some support behind us as well. For more information and related events, I will put a link in the chat right now for y'all. This is part of the Decolonizing Humanism stream, programming stream at the Center for Ideas in Society. A note on our roundtable format, we're gonna go for about, now 83 more minutes. The first little block of time here, about for 15 to 20 minutes, will be introductions from the group and some self-descriptions about what the groups do, our two participating collaborative collectives. The following 40 minutes, my co-facilitator and I will curate a conversation. And then the final half hour, we will open it up for a conversation, questions and comments from audience engagement. So folks, feel free to insert your questions at any point that you wish, since we're in webinar format. So it's my pleasure to introduce my longtime colleague and friend, Professor Karina Jackson, who's a visiting scholar in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. Karina is going to help facilitate the roundtable, as I said, but she's also going to serve as an active respondent, importantly, to the discussion points as we move along. A little bit of note on Dr. Jackson. Karina is an associate professor of education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she teaches courses on critical methodologies, youth studies, and pedagogy. Her interests converge around youth literacies, race and ethnic studies, media technologies, and learning in participatory cultures, as well as issues of equity in education. Central to her work are arts-based sociocultural approaches informed by radical women of color feminisms and critical theories in pursuing social inquiry. Karina is the author of a couple books, Youth Media Matters, Participatory Cultures and Literacies in Education. This was published by University of Minnesota and was the recipient of the AESA's Critics' Choice Book Award. Also the author of Youth Poets, Empowering Literacies in and Out of Schools, published by Peter Lang, and is working on a forthcoming book on race, gender, and technology at the School Work Nexus, to be published by Routledge. She's also the editor of Cultural Transformations, Youth and Pedagogies of Possibility, Harvard Education Press. As I mentioned, currently she's visiting scholar in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies and a collaborator in the Decolonizing Humanism programming stream with the Center for Ideas in Society. Finally, I will also say, Karina gifted me with some calamansi tree seeds a while back. I did try to grow them. They started to sprout. I might have overwatered a couple of them, but I'm gonna come back because I got more seeds saved. So yeah, Pinoy power. Thank you, Karina. With that, I'm gonna pass the mic to Karina. Karina, continue.
I have more calamansi if you would like them. Thank you all so much for being here. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. It's really a privilege to come on at any time and to be in this virtual space and to learn with all of you. Thank you to Dylan and the CIS for hosting this event, this wonderful event, and also to all the co-sponsors. Of course, thank you to my fellow panelists for their tremendous work in coming together today for this roundtable. I think we're going with hashtag undisciplining study on social media. So we're all connected in some ways, and today's convening, today's gathering is a form of study, which we will get into in a moment, as well as some introductions of our panelists. I should share that the idea of this event stemmed out of an earlier conversation with Dylan about some amazing work happening among and between collaboratives and working groups on different campuses in the midst of a global health pandemic. As many of you know, chats with Dylan, even really short ones, often lead to generative thinking and maybe some agitating and some building, right? I remember back in the day, on the Cal campus, majoring in ethnic studies, like other bright-eyed undergrads, being inspired by Dylan, who at the time was already making waves and showing many of us a particular path forward toward the PhD. And so here we are, right? Here we are today. I have the incredible task of casting the roundtable by offering a few remarks and also serving as facilitator along with Dylan. There are many different directions that we could take, but we've arranged several questions that have been previewed by our panelists to guide the exchange. But first, it's really important to acknowledge that a few years ago, there was an event at UC Riverside featuring Gustavo Esteva and Manolo Callahan on convivial research. I believe it was an intimate setting or taller workshop with faculty and students focused on collective pedagogies and the Zapatistas community-based education projects through their work with Universidad de la Tierra, Oaxaca, and Universidad de la Tierra, Califas, respectively. And a lot of movement building has happened since. So we remember Gustavo Esteva, who passed on last month. We honor his work and his legacy. So this gathering today echoes what has been established and continues to proliferate through many ideas, pedagogies, projects, and forms of insurgent learning through the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, CCRA. CCRA is a grassroots collective dedicated to exploring the intersections between collective pedagogies, convivial research, and local capacity building. So if you're interested, please access the center's website. I'll post it momentarily. I'll post the link momentarily. It has a lot of resources I think will be really helpful to continue this conversation. Now, according to the center, convivial research and insurgent learning is an open, ongoing space of encounter that amplifies community-based knowledges to seek alternatives to hierarchical and elitist knowledge practices and to promote insurgent learning. In short, convivial research engages the tradition of participatory, politically situated practices of collective, community-based knowledge production by highlighting transdisciplinary approaches that prioritize local shared interests. Approaches that also encourage a wide variety of inquiry tools and technologies to bring about poetic and situated knowledges. Because in every instance of community gathering like this one, there's always already the potential of a convivial tool, right? Building on the work of Ivan Illich, that's from 1973, Tools for Conviviality. Additionally, according to Manolo Callahan, in a piece in Arts Everywhere, speaking about specifically about Unitierra Califas, in recent years, there has been interest in spaces of learning and research, often articulated into autonomous oppositional spaces. These counter sites of inquiry have been central to radical democratic oppositions to capitalism's excesses, linking the reclaiming of knowledge commons with sustained confrontations against the most destructive forces of neoliberalism. Spaces of encounter within this context, along with advances in digital technologies, have made situated knowledge production more widely available. So this point is a really important one. This point about technologies is especially relevant as we continue to navigate work, engage in inquiry, and live through the impacts of the pandemic. The intersection of digital technologies and spaces of encounter has shaped knowledge production in various ways. So what Callahan refers to as autonomous zones are in fact networked, rhizomatic, informal spaces of encounter, where the role of facilitation is key in the horizontal, open, and flexible learning that happens. So on the one hand, today's topic on undisciplining study draws on convivial research in this sense of being concerned for generating and regenerating community through insurgent learning, which the Critical Anti-Violence Research and Action Working Group, GADA, will speak on more momentarily. On the other hand, within the field of education, today's topic also considers what education colleagues Belen Hernando Llores, Licho Lopez, Brenda Sanya, and Cameron McCarthy are spearheading in a forthcoming special issue in the Journal of Globalization, Societies, and Education. It's on conviviality in education and the making of difference. So as they note in the call for papers, there's a growing interest in scholarship employing critical approaches to understand the colonial legacies of conviviality in education today using a range of methodological and theoretical frameworks. To disentangle the multiplicity of meanings that conviviality takes up as a practice of modern governmentality and how it has been thought and practiced historically as it relates to race, ethnicity, gender, religion, among others. So it's a unique chance to think collectively and complicate the discourse of conviviality in education, a chance to probe the interrelationship of conviviality with the production of difference. So the panelists from the Collaborative for Global Studies and Transformative Education will have more to say about the paper being considered for that special issue. Now, the paper is about the praxis of the undercommons. It's one that disrupts normative practices of conviviality within a neoliberal colonizing university. So the paper extends Ivan Illich's reconceptualization of conviviality as a creative, interdependent tool, which can counter and conflict with the formulation of environments created for industrial productivity. University environments are neither free of tensions or contradictions, as Dylan noted, nor are they innocent with their many configurations. That is to say, conviviality's abuse as a colonizing tool creates an illusion that disguises the manifestations of power and hierarchical structures. So practices of conviviality within the university appears in many coded formations, right? Such as DEI initiatives, multicultural programming, the vibrancy of student life on newsletters and social media. And we know many of them are on the covers and the front pages, right? For example. So in these university formations, conviviality is fetishized, while individuals and groups are assumed to engage in harmonious relationships with one another, as if social identities and social categories are static and fixed. In the same vein, conviviality within the university is purported to cultivate connections between individuals and groups. So it's important to pause, right, to pay attention to conviviality, or the idea of convivial practices in the inner workings of the university, which in some ways function to maintain colonial logics and colonial modes of operation, especially in relation to research, right? The reasons why we've come together today, the role of study, right? Undisciplining study and pushing against categorical thinking. So in doing inquiry, in thinking about methods and methodology, the conversation today is very exciting and can flow in various directions, grow rhizomatically, open up more collective thinking, embolden approaches in our work, and deepen opportunities for insurgent learning, even strengthen current collaboratives and working groups, or maybe even sprout new ones in our respective contexts. So that said, we will begin with introductions, right? Then hear from our panelists and get into as many of the planned questions and new questions as possible. It's a conversation, so panelists, please chime in as we go. We have the chat box for resources and links. Like Dylan said, we aim for this roundtable to be fruitful. There's ample time on the back end for questions and comments. I think we're going to be using the question and answer feature for that. And so please post what resonates with you, and we will do our best to engage them all. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Here we go. Romina Garcia is a PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. As a doctoral student, Romina's research focuses on examining the structural and administrative anti-Black violence that encompasses women of color, in particular Black women within anti-violence work. Romina is a founding member of CARA, right? Critical Anti-Violence Research and Action Working Group, which is a UC-based collective that converges thought and action to end racialized gendered violence through an abolitionist and decolonial feminist approach. Romina is the author of All Canned Foods Are Expired, but Still Edible, a critique of anti-violence advocacy and the perpetuation of anti-Blackness, which unpacks the carceral treatment experienced by Black women, victims, survivors, navigating domestic violence, nonprofit advocacy services in her hometown of Chicago. Cynthia Martinez Perez is a first-generation PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. Her dissertation titled Freedom is a Place, Abolitionist Possibilities in Migrant Women's Refusals, draws from border immigration studies, critical carceral studies, and feminist theory to examine how migrant women refuse and resist the historical, discursive, and epistemic erasure of gender violence in ICE immigrant detention centers. Her dissertation is focused on Adelanto ICE Detention Center, where she also organizes and volunteers to support migrants fighting their asylum cases. Cynthia employs an archival and ethnographic analysis to resituate detailed migrant women's writings as anti-carceral and feminist abolitionist praxis that counter the state's diligent efforts to conceal gendered violence from the historical record. Through a critical reading of migrant women's hunger strike demands and personal correspondences, she locates migrant women as authors of abolitionist praxis. Sneha George is a PhD candidate in ethnic studies at UC Riverside. She received an MA in international relations at the New School in New York and a BA in women's studies and world history at the State University of New York in Albany. Sneha is currently a feminist and queer of color theorist whose dissertation work is on South Asian studies critique and other worldly possibilities through communal and relational self-reflexivity as praxis and being. Thank you all for being here. C. Carter is a newly minted PhD in education at UMass Amherst, applying the theoretical lessons of Black feminist thought. C rethinks the limits of educational mandates. C's scholarship reconceptualizes approaches to educational equity to guide shifts in teaching and research practices. Most recently, C's work traces how educational justice for youth of color is regulated through raciality, economy, and policy. Mariam Rashid is a PhD candidate in education at UMass Amherst. Her research interests are in refugee resettlement policies and practices in the US. In her current work, she explores how colonial, gendered, and racialized resettlement policies facilitate the dispossession of African refugees resettled in the US from East and Central Africa. Her inquiry draws on Black studies, feminist thought, and diasporic feminisms. Lastly, we have Benjamin Scherer, is a PhD candidate in education and W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at UMass Amherst. His work draws from Black studies, river and wetland ecology, and critical cartographic practices. Through archival study, his current project disrupts disciplined climate change education by retelling flooding and catastrophe in the American South. Thank you all for being here. So let me now turn to Romina, Cynthia, and Sneha. You are members of CARA. Please lead us and share a bit about CARA, its purpose, its formation as a working group, what animates your work, what do y'all do? And the same questions for C, Mariam, and Ben.
Thank you so much. I will start off the conversation and Cindy and Sneha will jump in and fill in. Just really quickly, CARA is a collective that was started at UCR in ethnic studies around 2018, 2019. CARA specifically, as mentioned, is a collective that addresses racialized gender violence through a feminist, abolitionist, decolonial lens. We like to think of ourselves as not just another academic roundtable talking as a form of resistance, but instead including this action component. So we attempt to build bridges, make connections among different struggles, trying to address racialized gender violence. And in that, we simultaneously also challenge the idea of isolation, that 100% comes with different forms of advocacy, different forms of project making. And all of this is to build capacity, possibly establish an action component to the actual eradication of the discursiveness of racialized gender violence.
Yes, and I want to add to, thank you, Romina, for introducing CARA. So Romina and I were also co-founders of CARA in 2018. And this working group actually came out of different folks at UCR, graduate students and faculty who were doing work or are doing work on gender and sexual state violence in our research, but also many of us who are victim survivors as well, because even us as doing this critical work and research doesn't mean that we exist outside of the parameters of state gendered violence. So we came together to form this group and to really attempt to do something different with the way that research is thought about in the university as being isolated and amongst ourselves. And our aim has been to be community-led or to really try to integrate the community efforts locally here with our research, especially in a place such as Riverside that is kind of, I'm thinking about like a forgotten place, as Ruthie Gilmore talks about, like the forgotten places, Riverside, the Inland Empire is really thought about this isolated place from Los Angeles, far away from Los Angeles. So we saw the need for that. And that's why we formed this group. And I do also want to mention that a lot of our work and our organizing draws from Black feminist theory, ideas of mutual aid organizing, and different ways of caring and transformative justice, or we have had discussions about what justice looks like, as well as we frame our organizing after grassroots organizations such as Survived and Punished. We have worked with one of the members in our group, Elisa Biera, who was also a founder of CARA, who's also part of Survived and Punished. So, for example, one of the things I think about a lot for the purpose of this group is thinking about interpersonal violence as state violence inherently. So that was one of the goals of CARA, to really bring, that intersection of action with research, even though we've ran into contradictions, which hopefully we talk about these contradictions later. But yeah, that's a little more about what we do here in CARA, or the intentions of what our group has been.
Yeah, and just to highlight some of the things we're working on now, we're working on a training for anyone, but particularly university folks, a training on sexual assault and domestic violence. So what does it mean to address sexual assault and domestic violence on campuses, that in a space that's inherently state-led, inherently neoliberal? How do we have an abolitionist crisis response in a space that's so not abolitionist? So we are working on this training in the coming weeks. But yeah, that's what we're working on now.
Should I jump in with the collaborative? Okay. Well, we are affectionately known as the Undercommons Constellation, or UC2. But our collaborative story really started in the basement of the College of Education at UMass Amherst, where we came together to take a course in critical educational research. And before that, though, we each were sort of critically questioning about our work and thinking about ethical care in our work, and seeking to practice our work in a way that would engage multiple ways of knowing, and engage in knowledge making with the communities we were working with. And so we were committed to that ethic of care, also wanting to not repeat a Western gaze on the work that we were doing, not wanting to repeat these very inhumane modes of representation that we saw happening within the university through DEI initiatives. And, we really just didn't want to repeat the idea that the communities we were working with were damaged or deficit in any kind of way. So those were like big questions that were on our mind before we even got to that classroom space. And then, we were also positioned by the university to take research courses, right, to fulfill in order to get our doctorate degrees. And so, part of me was just kind of looking to get the requirements met when I first walked into that classroom, but then quickly started to shift how I was thinking about that through looking at syllabus, through engaging with folks on a more personal level. But really the course content was multimodal. It was inviting us to practice our theory as method. It centered the work of scholars of color, which we weren't honestly seeing in a lot of other courses that we were taking. And so our work is really animated by understanding that there was another way to be together, to practice our work together. We're animated spatially, like we were literally underground. And I know Mari and Ben have a lot to say about that. We were also animated by these questions that we were seeking to answer about the context of education in our work. We're also trying to exercise our agency within being positioned to take these particular requirements mandated by the university, and just also wanting to engage our work artfully, critically, and engaging in alternate expressions of learning. And so we quickly deepened our study through that course together and decided that we wanted to get together for a part 2 to follow up in the fall. And that's where we started to write a lot more together and deepen our work in that way. So I'll pass it to Mariam and Ben to add a little bit there.
Yeah, thanks, Chalet. And I'll also add that being in that space, I think for the first time, the very first class, Ben joined us later on, it was different in a way that felt, I don't want to use the word safe, it felt really different because we were all students of color. For the first time, you get into a class and you see students of color and the faculty of color together. And there's something that's sparked from that space that has continued to date. And adding to what Chalet mentioned, I think from that time, that was early 2020, spring of 2020, we've benefited from mutual care and love. Chalet has shared that for our work, one another, and really the need to be answerable and accountable to communities that we work with. My research is with refugee communities within Northeastern United States. And I kept on asking myself, how can I do this work in a way that doesn't cause more harm to these communities, especially in the processes of being resettled in the US? And I think there's also something to be said about being present, being open and willing to just learn from what each one of us was doing, whether it was research, whether it was writing or doing presentations or just sharing readings. And in so doing, understanding that there's a relationality, in what we are each doing on an individual level. And I think in this kind of practice, scholars might be able to thrive in community, in counter rhythm to the outside or what the neoliberal university is offering us. And I think there's also an aspect of livingness that opens up, new ways of seeing, new ways of doing research. And I think we are still going with that. And I think it's something that we are all proud of. Ben, you wanna jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Mariam. I'll just jump in briefly. It's great to be here with everyone today. And one component of our group that continues to resonate with me is this idea of unconditional relations and relationality, and the idea that within the group, we have a different form of relationality than outside of the group. And so as co-conspirators here with Dr. Huxton, with Mariam, with Chalet, we're each working together to animate our own work, but working in a collective practice or praxis, we might say, that allows us to do work in different ways that wouldn't be possible if we weren't if we didn't have this non-optional relation in relation to other forms of optional relations that we often see practiced outside of the group. So
thank you all. Thank you all for introducing the work of these two collectives. It's deeply engaging. I know that there's a lot of folks that are in attendance who both work very closely with graduate students who are thinking through counter-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary methods that either are in close relation to convivial research or actually are an iteration of convivial research. So that leads to the first scripted question that we wanted to bring to you all, which is to really kind of illustrate for the folks who are here and for the folks that'll be watching the video. Can you offer some examples of how you do convivial research in your individual and collective work and study? Can you offer some examples of how you've maybe even challenged or pushed at the limits of convivial research methods and practices that as people have come to understand them and move toward other forms of praxis in your work? I'm going to ask Romina to get us started, and then folks just chime in from there.
So I think, as mentioned in our introduction, conviviality should never be this homogenizing form of thought and action. And I think at first we thought it was a bad thing, but I think over time we've realized in CARA, we're all coming to this one specific theme topic from different positionalities. Our work is very different. People are doing mutual aid, border studies, domestic violence, sexual assault, environmental stuff. But I always think of this, Ruha Benjamin recently said that radicalizing research should be about bringing your whole self to the table, right? And I think if you were to ever sit in our conversations, we literally are all pulling from our everyday lives. Recently, a couple of us are moms within CARA, and we have high school students, and we're trying to think of ways of how we can provide something as simple as condoms and contraceptives to our high school students, because sometimes they can't even get them at their schools, right? Or handing out sandwiches and drinks after classes, or just creating networks within our own campus of creating safety plans, these pods where we can kind of depend on each other in case something happens on campus, and also trying to address burnout before it even gets to burnout. So always recognizing first and foremost that we are not all coming to this space with one single thought, one form of action. allowing ourselves to have those contradictory types of conversations, not taking it personal, right? We don't necessarily have to be in love with the people that we work with, but we all understand that we're trying to get to point from A to B, right? So just respecting each other's space and positionality, their own approach to their work, and never trying to create this model, right? This streamlined version of how we should be doing things. I think that's where abolition really comes into play for Cara, that it's never about building a model. It's never about doing it one way and not the other way, but just always allowing ourselves to evolve, to continuously account for different positionalities, and just always growing.
Go ahead, Miriam, you wanted to address this as well.
Was it Cara going first then for the question, or it's back and forth?
We're doing this convivially, so so we're going back and forth. I want to kind of mesh these groups a little bit. So why don't you go? I know you're ready to roll. So go.
All right. Yeah, I'll take that. So for me, and I think the example that I want to give here is within the framework of the institution and the field of education specifically. And my program, I'm within the field of international education and development. So there's an expectation to conform to certain codes and logics. And I think that really shows up in so many different ways, doing research, the readings that we do, and how you're supposed to collect your data, how you're supposed to write your data. It shows up in so many different ways. And within the field of international education specifically, the norm is to study international education and development through Western epistemologies that really do very little to contextualize issues of race and racism, forms of dispossession and anti-Blackness. And the other expectation is to go do international development work or research on the other side. So, we are based in the United States, where I'm supposed to study here, but move probably to Kenya, where I originally came from, to go conduct research with those other people in Kenya. And I think thinking through this with our readings and the engagement that I've had with my colleagues is asking myself, how can I do that research within the context of the United States, where policies of refugee resettlement, happens, where we have think tanks making decisions here. So how can I start thinking with that? And I think also bringing in ideas of texts, how can I start engaging with Black text? And for me, I think going back to the works of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and theorizing with Ngugi wa Thiong'o really situates me in looking at refugee resettlement and forms of dispossession within this context. And I'm able to have those conversations with those people who are doing resettlement, those people who are designing policies. So that change for me, that subversive change for me, I think is important, so that within this Western space, people begin to rethink what research should look like, what data should look like, because it's here where dispossession starts happening, not on the other side.
Thank you, that's excellent. Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to expand on some of the contradictions that I kind of briefly mentioned with doing convivial work in Cara. And as I mentioned, we came to do work with Cara as, academics who were already doing the similar work, but usually we're taught to do it individually. So we said, hey, we're all doing similar work. Let's be in communication with each other. Let's not do this individual isolating work that the university tells us to do because we're in competition with each other and it's about who does it better, right? But the contradiction that I found in Cara, which I think my colleagues would agree, is that a lot of the times the intention and the goal was for us to do research and action, but we've been lacking on the action part a lot. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think that makes sense because the more I think about it, it's a paradox to think about community work and research in so many ways. And the way that has showed up in our organizing is that or our collective work is that if we're following the community, right, but then there's no community demands, or the community is not reaching out to us, what do we do as academics, or how can we insert ourselves and be leaders of action when we are ourselves, we have that gaze as a researcher. And if we propose actions, then it's not being grassroots led. So that's something that we've like struggled with in CARA, to come to that point of doing the action, because we're in the academy. And it really is almost a paradox to do action and research, at least in a way where action could be genuine, because there's always going to be that academic gaze. And with that said, I think for me, what I've sat through with is thinking about the research that I do and being a community member. A lot of the times, my involvement, I know that it benefits me for my career, my research, whatever I'm writing, a publication, right? So those power structures are always there. And that's something we struggle with. And I think that's the limit of convivial research within the neoliberal university, specifically at the UC level, where, no matter what, as much as we try to do research and do learning in another way, in a different transformative way, those power structures are still there, where we are the researcher and this is our career and we do have that power.
Right on. Go ahead, Sneha, and then Ben.
Thank you all for what you all said. I think it's also important and important for our group is we're not asking who's doing research well, we're asking who's doing liberation well and learning from them. And I think that radically changes the work, right? So we're not looking to the university for answers, rather we're looking at the movements that have been happening throughout the years, right? Like, how has the Black Panthers had an effective education strategy in creating a movement? How does Survived and Punished do that these days? So I think when your goal is liberation, it radically changes how you view research and our work. Like, we already know it's violent. So who you're learning from completely changes when you ask that question, when you put liberation at the center of your work.
I'll just quickly chime in. I had a specific example of something that I and others began to find ourselves doing in a series of classes that we participated in. And so I think from my own experience, typically being in graduate classes, I see it very much at times a form of competition or kind of adversarial relationship in terms of, who can do the best presentation, who can, represent a scholar, in their work, in the most effective way. And shifting from that individualistic way of thinking in terms of more of a radical classroom practice or praxis, what we began doing is kind of riffing off of each other's work and building from one another. And so actually kind of being in conversation with each other in terms of the formatting of the presentations, and in terms of what came out of the discussions. And so that I think in a maybe what we might call a traditional classroom, this would be called cheating, or this would be called plagiary. But in this case, we honored each other's work and were able to have a different kind of conversation by doing so.
So speaking of respect and honoring work, the next question that we have here is what is the role of study? What intellectual histories or sites of study does your working group or collaborative draw on? C, will you lead us with this one?
Absolutely. So when we first came together in terms of intellectual histories, we were really focused on decolonizing research, decolonizing pedagogy, so the work of Lee Patel, Eve Tuck, Kei Wen Yang. We also were engaged in a study of new materialist feminist approaches to inquiry and voice, destabilizing our understanding of voice. And also a personal favorite, I think, of this collaborative, Ezekiel Dixon Roman's work on alternative ontologies. And then moving into that part 2 course, I think we were all really excited to deepen our study of Black scholars' work, or Black study. So that looked like us engaging with anti-colonial scholars, Black feminists, such as Denise Ferreira da Silva, Sylvia Winter, Catherine McKittrick, Hortense Spillers, right? And then for me, the role of study was really going from just sort of reading these scholars to asking, you know, how are they making those critical interventions? So not only reading for like, what am I getting out of this? Or like, what, they're blowing my mind with this, you know, just trying to put it together, but also engaging with them through their methodologies, which weren't showing up as like a bullet point list of all of the strategies they took to to take out the Western gaze or take off the Western gaze. So I really appreciated like just deepening our study together and learning to like have them allow us to release those colonial inquiry practices. And something I really appreciate from Harney and Moten, that consent to disruption, like of the traditional practices that I have been learning and using in my work. So yeah, I'll kick it to whoever wants to turn next.
I'll jump in real quick. For Cara, I'll make it quick. I'm thinking about study as not just an exclusively academic, but as Sneha was, you know, mentioning, like the Black Panther Party, right? And the way, like the way that they create alternative modes of education. So I know it's contradictory, again, for us as academics to be in the institution and to think about ways that education happens outside of academia. But I think that's the goal. That's what we're aiming for, to create alternative ways of learning and alternative ways of study. So when I think about the importance of study, I'm thinking about studying, you know, texts by the Combahee River Collective, studying texts by the Black Panther Party and the ways they organize, or even contemporary ways that our communities are organizing or creating other liberatory knowledges and way of being. So I guess what I want to say is that study doesn't have to be exclusively like an elite academic or just studying, you know, folks in the academy. You know, Romina and Sneha want to add to that.
Yeah, I think also too, again, I'm gonna always, so my background before I got to graduate school, I don't have this amazing pedigree. Like I don't have a really extensive academic background. I was a teen mom. I went to community college, went to a small liberal arts college, and then I got here because I wanted to do work back in Chicago, and I was told that I couldn't without a PhD, right? So I have always told my students, and in conversations that I've had with other academics, other grad students, professors, right, is that I think Cara also too values and centers lived experiences, right? And that's definitely coming out of our alignment with a Black feminist politic, understanding that all our experiences are valid, and having that lead how we do work, how we work towards liberation, as Sneha mentioned, and just allowing things to move and shape as they may as we move. Not necessarily forward, right? Not playing into this idea that we'll get better, right? This progressive idea, but like letting us move in a way that is always changing and accounting.
Miriam, I think you wanted to address this as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I want to bring up Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods, who talk about the formation of Black geographies as central in the construction of the global community. And one of the things that they bring up is the idea of Black geographies as a site for a deeper reflection, you know, with the varied ways in which Black people theorize, seek, you know, enact placemaking. And I reference Black geographies here, not just to mean the physical environment, but also those ways that we make and enact different forms of knowledge. And I think for our collaborative, for example, another aspect of study that has evolved and continue to evolve is not just the classroom. Since none of us has been a formal classroom since the fall of 2020, but also in so many informal engagements and encounters, whether talking on phone, sometimes we'll have conversations via phone where we talk about something that happened, and we are like, yeah, this seems like a teachable, a learning moment. How can we bring this into our study, into our research, into our ways of thinking, whether it's laughing with one another or looking at one of the statements that hits your inbox, one of those diversity statements that hits your inbox, you look at it, you laugh and be like, oh, there's something here that I want to think about, that I want to write about, that I want to share. So there are all these spaces that kind of look as angiographic, but at the same time, there's so much learning that happens within those very environments.
So that's a really kind of rhizomatic question for me, asking about role of study and thinking about Lee Patel's recent book. I have it here, No Study Without Struggle, Confronting Settler Colonialism in Higher Education. And the book starts out with Robin D.G. Kelly's 2016 Boston Review piece, Black Study, Black Struggle, and really, kind of putting a lot of what you have noted in terms of, study doesn't have to be, in these formal spaces of learning and in these academic spaces. And so the book, No Study Without Struggle, also includes a lot of references to the Undercommons, Harney and Moten's The Undercommons. And I just wanted to share briefly before we go into the next question, and kind of riffing off of Mariam's point, a quote from Harney and Moten: "The Undercommons study is what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three, held under the name of speculative practice. The point of calling it study is to mark the incessant and irreversible intellectuality of these activities is already present." All right, and I'm also thinking about Bell Hooks, who, much earlier, around, intellectual engagement happens in all kinds of, classrooms. They don't have to be like academic classrooms. Like we could be, we could have our kids at the park, playing around, and we could sit at the bench talking, and we could be engaging in intellectual work. So I think that that's a really important one to point out in terms of, various forms of study have emerged out of, these informal spaces of learning. What we see, on college campuses in terms of, activism, the activism has stemmed out of what's happened already, or what has been happening in terms of movement building, right, in different communities. And so I appreciate these points as we look into the next question, or we're going to the next question. If you could speak back to your field or disciplinary area, what would you say? What do you hope to see in and beyond the university? Ben, would you like to lead us with that one?
Yeah, thank you, Karina. What would I like to see? There are a lot of things. Returning to this book that we've all been reading, I'll just share it out here a little bit. Brilliantly, it's free online as well. It's open source. But Hardy and Moten referred to a process in the university that they call professionalization. And so the idea that there's this continuous refinement within the university that takes away from the questioning of ideas and concepts and instead refines it for specific professions. So for an example, I come from the discipline of education or the field of education. And today in teaching practices and certification programs, the forms of education that are offered are very specific, that don't offer an opportunity to question or theorize or come up with critical pedagogies in terms of why you're doing what you're doing, and in terms of the histories behind why you're doing what you're doing as well. And so thinking about what they call fugitivity or maroonage or different forms of resistance that can work both to resist professionalization, but both can, and then at the same time can work outside of it. So between disciplines, beyond disciplines. One example that came to mind was actually with C, who does a lot of work with teacher training, I know, and she was able to bring in some Black texts, including Parable of the Sower, to rupture some of the disciplinary training that she offered. I don't know if there's time for her to talk about that, but that's one form of.
Go ahead, Sneha.
Once again, I would say when liberation is at the center of our work, then I would tell, we're from ethnic studies, I would tell ethnic studies that our presence in the university isn't enough. Ethnic studies as a field and a discipline, gender studies as a field and a discipline, it's not enough. It's not reaching to liberation. And I think we need to remember where our field actually came from. It came from struggle. It came from liberation movement building. And I feel like that's been lost as we become more professionalized. And one thing that's really critical that Fred Moten, as well as, I'm forgetting the author, but in the book, Third University is Possible, what they both say is, as critical scholars, yes, as critical scholars, we are at once, our content of our research is resisting the university, but we are also a part of the university, right? So if the university is a machinery of the state, we are part machine, right? We are also compliant. So I think it's critical to say that just because you're in an ethnic studies department, gender studies department doing this work, it does not mean that we're necessarily doing the work of liberation, but it is to then be in conversation with the movement building, with liberation builders outside of the university, and then wreak havoc in the university, completely try to imagine it, destruct it. Think of a university that's in utopia, that's impossible, but building towards it together.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because in teacher education, I think, and that's, yeah, teacher education, we're very focused on policy. It structures a lot of what we do in the classroom. And it feels hard to break free from because you're heavily assessed and et cetera. But in talking to other teacher educators, our anti-racist efforts are often imagined within the bounds of those policies. And I think there's something valuable about saying no, right? Like, I think teachers who are on the front lines of strikes and youth who are walking out of schools are really pushing us to get a little bit more subversive. And so I think in the act of saying no, there are things that open up for us. And so I'm really interested in seeing that more from teacher education, and doing without permission, or doing on our own terms is really important to me. And one of the things that felt important to say no to and working with education or English educators is how to talk about anti-racism without replicating violence. And this is something that a question I really only came to in doing work with the collaborative, right? And looking at Catherine McKittrick's work, like how do I do anti-racism without replicating violence? That it was a question it was a question I kept talking about, but didn't have the words to articulate until reading her work and engaging with her work. And so, through Parable of the Sower, bringing that into the classroom has been a way to center how there could be these horrific things happening, but people are navigating in critical ways that write themselves into the future. They're not just sort of violated bodies, here we are dead, etc., right? But we can actually have a critical conversation about how people think about rehearsing something other than a racial capitalist expression of the world. And I think Parable of the Sower, for me, really invites that conversation in the classroom among students, amongst English educators, etc. So yeah, that's what I would say.
That's excellent. I appreciate the feedback and the conversation that we've initiated here. And I'm hoping that folks who watch this recording will realize how fruitful all this is to kind of instigate ongoing collective study and conversations in whatever circles they're in doing this kind of work. I'd like to open it up for the last 25 minutes here to both collective conversation among the roundtables, if you all have kind of questions or provocations for each other. So have that in mind. But I also want to honor the fact that we have a few questions coming from our attendees. So I'll get us started with that by raising the first one, which is, I think, a great one. It's a bibliographic one. It's a citational one. So maybe we can all, take physical mental notes. And again, I'm glad this is being recorded because this will help us kind of structure bibliography for those of us that might be new to convivial research. Joshua Adler is asking us, what are some names, some texts, and some other forms of media that you all would recommend for those who want to learn about convivial research? And you all just chime in, just unmute and just go at it.
So I'll jump in because I forgot to post it. I said I was going to post, but the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy has a website with lots of resources. Let me see if I could pull that up. Manolo Callahan's work, Gustavo Esteva's work. I also had mentioned something about conviviality in education and sort of the push that is being, that's coming from some of the scholars I mentioned. I'll post those names. That's Belen Hernando Llorens, Licho Lopez, Brenda Sanya, and Cameron McCarthy. And I specifically want to shout out Belen Hernando Llorens' work on modern governmentality and differentiating citizenship, criminalizing diversity. This is kind of problematizing conviviencia in education in the context of Spain. So I'll post those as well.
Cool, Cynthia, and then Sneha, you all wanted to offer a couple texts here. Maybe you could talk as well, just briefly, about why they're important in response to Joshua's question.
Okay, I'll go briefly. I recommended Engaging Contradictions by Charles Hale. It's an anthology, and there's different contributors to this anthology. I really just read the essay by Ruthie Gilmore that's fresh in my mind. So I would really recommend that because she really does talk about the contradictions of, again, doing convivial research. So I think she speaks to the limits of it from her experience, which made sense to the work I'm doing. And as someone who's doing community work, a lot of times struggle with these contradictions in my own work, for example. So if, I'm doing work with women resisting gendered violence, I like to talk about this as abolitionist feminist work, but the community doesn't necessarily see themselves as that way, right? Like they don't describe themselves as feminists, for example. So I think this, at least the essay from Ruthie Gilmore talks about those contradictions in the community, especially if we're talking about like anti-prison and liberatory politics. Sometimes convivial research and the folks we're engaging with in community don't really share those politics as you. So that would be a really good text to look at that I recommend.
Good. We have a few texts flowing in. So maybe Sneha, you can talk about yours real quick.
Sure. I put two in the text, in the chat. One is Fugitive Pedagogy, which recently kind of came out. And I think it gives you a real tangible ways of historical ways people have been learning and spreading knowledge that was very against anti-Blackness, and it centered escape actually from institutions. And then the second one is this article written by Tiffany Lathabo King. And I think that one's really interesting because she talks about like this urgency amongst critical scholars to theorize on race and move past identity, all this stuff that's really popular right now. But she says, we have to do it with care, right? You can't just theorize and write stuff, right? Because the university is going to make us feel anxious to do that. But if you don't do it with care, we'll reproduce the same violences that we're against. And she has specific text she critiques in there. But those are two things that really influenced me.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, the text most influenced our forthcoming paper, as I was talking about earlier, is titled "The Undercommons: Fugitive Planning and Black Study" by Harney and Moten. And it would probably take me another 4 years just to talk about all the ideas in the text. But one that was really fruitful for us is just the idea of moving beyond critique. Yes, there is a very valid and important role of critique, but there's also this idea of fugitivity or marronage, or creating these other types of spaces where other logics and other possibilities can be thought about, can be formed, which was very generative for us in a lot of ways.
Excellent, appreciate that. Go ahead, Romina.
Yeah, I think Ben read my mind. I think a more generative way of thinking of conviviality is not necessarily seeking out texts that are specific to conviviality, but being able to interpret and critically think about work that maybe doesn't call on this specific word, but is so profoundly and fundamentally convivial, right? We have Native studies, Native feminist studies out there, queer studies, always the canon of Black feminist thought. So just, I think, taking a more critical approach in the way, in Dylan's famous words, like a praxis, right? A reading praxis of how we can kind of pull out that conviviality that we don't necessarily have to name it, but is just present already.
I had been unmuted all this time. There's another question there, but I do want to also mention a couple of other texts that have been central to our reading and thinking and writing practices. Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science and Other Stories, that we do a lot of storying in our work. And also have been borrowing from a lot of like poetic methodologies, and so like actually reading poems, reading poetry books, right? And then also see if you want to chime in here, but playlists, actually making music playlists and listening to songs. Because they're not just all like books and articles, right? Like we are inspired by, and we can have like these generative moments just by listening to something or seeing something, an art piece, for instance. So there are many examples of those, certainly. But I also want to make sure we get to the second question that we have in Q&A. And this is a question, what are some of the practices in research that you might recommend that I look into that are not associated with colonial practices? I would love to use CRT as a framework for my own dissertation, potentially focusing on migrants as a population.
I can jump in here. One thing I'm thinking about that comes from Soyini, am I saying the name correct? Soyini Madison, Critical Ethnography, text 2005. But when I read that text, it really pushed me to put the gaze on myself, or turn that lens that you may want to put on other people on yourself. And so it's played out in my work by really, in my work with youth, rethinking how power dynamics, rethinking how the spaces that I might have chosen to have an interview were really contributing to what was able to be said, or what came out in that space. And so a big thing for me is really thinking about power dynamics, identity, my role as a researcher, and being just as, not seeing myself as an all-knowing and distant researcher, but really leaning into how I'm also constituting the moments in the research or work with the folks I'm engaged with. And so that's one thing I would share.
Yeah, I would also add that in my work, I know a lot of times, especially when we are doing qualitative research, we want the thick data, we want to categorize, we want to create patterns, we want to have themes, that's kind of the traditional way that we have been taught. And I keep on questioning that in my work. For me, I am deliberately, intentionally resisting categories. I'm intentionally resisting patterns and codes and themes in qualitative research. Instead, I want to find out what is it that is being said, whether it's in a policy. I read policy documents, resettlement policy documents, and I want to see within that policy documents, what is it that is not coming out? And when I have, I don't call them interviews, when I have conversations with the people that I work with, the refugee population that I work with, it's for the purposes of IRB, of course, I do have, a semi-structured interview protocol, but I enter that space in a way where we are having conversation. And I'm learning that in having conversations, there's so much that they're offering me, sometimes even asking me questions that I'm not aware of. And so makes me start thinking and going back to figure out, oh, this is the question that I'm being asked and I don't have an answer for it. What is it that this person is trying to communicate to me? So kind of being open to other ways of reading your data, other ways of reading your policy documents. And I think BR Science also offers a lot of that. I think leaning on Black studies for me really helps.
We have a great question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. That is so funny that you say that, Mary. I just had this conversation with a professor of mine, and I was telling him that I'm currently reading through some materials. But the way I said it very I'm I'm reading through this stuff, but I'm reading transcripts of women who are currently incarcerated, who have experienced sexual abuse, domestic violence. And I told him that I feel so not unethical, but it makes me, I have not critically thought about seeing that as a relationship with someone, instead of just seeing it as a material that I'm reading, that I intentionally, I'm fully awake. I'm not laying in bed. I'm present in the moment as I'm reading this material to rehumanize. I don't know if that's a horrible word to use, but because it comes with so many other, right? Whatever. But I just feel that having a critical reading praxis, at least for the material that we engage with, is a baby footstep, right? It's something towards not having this neoliberal kind of isolated, this is something that I'm reading about rather than an experience I'm having with this other person that just happens to be through, I know Cindy does a lot of work with women in prison through letters, right? Through having conversations, making connections through letters, through transcripts, through surveys. I agree with that approach.
This is great, you all. I have a great question that came from Maria Fervino in the chat. So let me raise that, and then Cynthia, you can get us started on this one, maybe, if that's okay. So yeah, think through it as I read this. This is Maria. What are some tactics and strategies for disrupting and even destroying the continuously colonizing university without having the university destroy us or exile us as engaged scholars? Many of us are already in precarious positions in the university. We're untenured. Some of us are adjunct. Many of us are lecturers, many of us are grad student instructors, and so forth. And of course, within this question, there are other questions about the relationships and tensions between collegiality, conviviality, and camaraderie. And you know what, I think Cynthia is an excellent person to start thinking about this because, you know, you're finishing your degree very soon. You know, you've been awarded the Chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship at UC Santa Cruz. You're navigating a bunch of different offers. I mean, so you're in this position of both extraordinary earned, you know, access and privilege, but also vulnerability, right? And this is what you and I talk about all the time. So maybe you can offer a situated response to that, and then others can as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many conversations with people that even though I'm in this place where I'm, you know, getting some academic recognition, I've been pushed out at every moment of my academic career. So this question really resonates with me because it's like, what are some tactics and strategies? I don't know if there's tactics and strategies, honestly, because I have to remind myself and others, like, you know, first generation, people of color, low income, you know, working class background, that the university is not for us. We don't belong in these spaces in the sense that they're not built for us, right? Not just like I'm talking traditionally, but even nowadays. And the work we do is work that it's always going to be met with either like hostility or work that's not going to be valued by the academy. I know someone else in the chat asked, in the questions asked about like fellowships and, you know, meeting those like commitments to like external funding and so forth. You know, there's no real way, in my opinion, to really make the work that we want to do that is legible to the university, because the university doesn't set out that goal to do liberatory work. Yes, we're going to have to work within it sometimes, and it gets co-opted a lot of the times. And I'll admit my work gets co-opted all the time through the university. And I understand that I have to speak the language of the university. But if we want to do radical work, we're going to be met with hostility at every step at the stage. And that's just what comes with the territory of doing this work, especially if we want to create an alternative, you know, university or another way of engaging with each other and having a grassroots, you know, education. Like it's not going to be accepted. It's really going to challenge people. And I know, Dylan, you also had a lot of struggle in academic senate and so forth. You know, so yeah, I guess someone else could speak to that as well.
In fact, I think Romina wants to.
Yeah.
So I definitely am one of the people that Cindy has probably had this conversation with that is on the total opposite side of that. We kind of get into it a lot because, you know, when I did get to grad school, and I think Ben mentioned this too, this idea of professionalization, right? Professionalizing ourselves so that we can be palpable to the university, in future employers, grants, fellowships, all these things. And I've always pushed back on that. I understood that I sound a certain way. Again, like I don't have this amazing academic background, but I've always pushed back on that, even down to our fellowships and the grants that we apply to. There's just certain grants that I refuse to apply to because you're not gonna, the feedback that you give me is not generative. You're not gonna take the anti-Black carceral work that I'm trying to highlight seriously. And you're gonna tell me, I specifically center the experiences of Black women, and I've had people respond to my grant applications that my work would be taken more seriously if I included all women. And they just, in my head, I'm just like, you're the reason why this anti-Blackness needs to be called out in the first place, and I refuse to engage with that. So I'm very much the kind of, don't engage with it. I too, I'm, you know, a teenage mom, first generation. I'm the first one to finish college in my family. I understand that all of us are in very specific precarious situations, but I've just found it more fruitful for myself. I feel more at peace with myself to not engage with it flatly as much as I could or can.
So if I could jump in, it's really short. I know we have a few more questions here, but my answer is really short because I think part of the answer to the question around, you know, how to be, you know, how to continue to thrive and not survive, but thrive and find the joys in what we do is partly this, right here on the screen. Is a collaborative, is a collective, right? And so I've been reading Sarah Ahmed's latest book. I don't know if it shows up, but Complaint is the title of the book. And in that book, that certainly is a great resource, but in that book, how it ends is super awesome because it talks about collectives and the role of collectives. Right. And, you know, I see like study groups, right? I see working groups. I see these types of collaboratives as a way of responding to those tensions, to those contradictions, to those everyday struggles of being a member of, you know, a neoliberal colonizing university. So with that, I know we have a couple more questions. I don't know, Dylan, did you want to jump in there since you probably have a lot to say?
I wanted to make a little bit of room here at the end with apologies to the attendees whose questions we haven't been able to ask yet. We will curate those questions and perhaps post them as part of the video once we, you know, assuming we publish the video. But I thought maybe we could spend the last few minutes to close out this great conversation by asking our collective members here who are coming from, you know, two institutions on the opposite side of the continent, but are so deeply entangled with each other's work in ways that in most ways I anticipated. In some ways I'm you know, catalyzed by, you know, not surprised by, but just it's pushed at the limits of how I understood that meshing between y'all. So I thought maybe it would be kind of fun and kind of be interesting to open up a small portion of our time here to end, to have you all raise questions for each other and maybe not even respond to them, maybe just raise them for each other, maybe because they're questions to ask yourselves. So yeah, what do y'all want to know about each other's work, about how you do it? Certain terms keep going through my mind when I think about conviviality, when I think about collective study, including terms, you know, terms like self-defense, terms like insurgency, terms like rebellion, you know, things that that cast a different perspective on how we understand creative and intellectual rigor, as academics call it. You know, that everything that you all have done here is so deeply rigorous in a challenging way, and I hope from some people in a really decentering and displacing way. You know, so yeah, maybe we can close out with that. Maybe we can go. Why don't we go around our 6, well, really 7, counting Karina. Can I ask you all to maybe just raise a question for us to take with us as we go from here? Just unmute and go first, whoever can do it, whoever's courageous enough to be first. I'll ask all 7 of y'all to go. Go ahead, Sneha.
And this relates to the last question, but how do y'all, I think it's really important as academics to also not be an academic, and to have fun and to do stuff outside, like not professional stuff. So how do y'all not get sucked into the university being your whole life? Like, what are you doing for fun? How do you center fun? How do you make time for fun? Yeah.
Beautiful. Great question. Who's next?
I could go next. I want to know, like, what can we do now every day to build another university? What are the small actions we could do every day, enact every day, to build another university or to tear down the academy from the position we're in?
Yeah, y'all keep me coming back to the idea. Well, it's more than an idea. It's the genealogy of the thing we call the academy. It's aspirational. You know, it's not the same thing as tracking a genealogy of a college or a university or a school. It's not the same thing. Just like academic is not the same thing as a scholar or an intellectual or practitioner or creator or an artist. Who wants to keep us going with these questions to close us out?
Yeah, mine is kind of going back to the contradictions and tensions that we all experience, especially for students of color within the neoliberal colonizing university. And it's related to the methods and research that we're all using, that you all are sharing. Are there challenges that come up, maybe within your committees or with your advisors, that you have to wrestle with, and how do you go about that?
That's great. Who's next between y'all haven't spoken yet? Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, it's a question I wrestle with a lot, looking in terms of issues of education in relation to climate change and how to teach it. And just returning to this bigger question that I want to ask all of you is, like, is it even possible to address like the big questions, the big problems that we're talking about in our daily lives without, or with, I could say, within the constructs of a discipline? Like, how do we address that, and what would it mean to think about discipline differently, to work in between discipline, but whatnot. So.
Excellent, thank you.
I would say, yeah. How do we think about people 200 years from now? And I'll leave it there.
I love that. That's great. That's great. Who hasn't spoken yet? I think is it Cynthia and Corina haven't spoken yet? Oh, sorry, Romina. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Romina.
no, I'm a pessimist at heart. So is this conversation trivial at the end of the day? Like, unless we put that in practice, C and Cynthia, you guys are graduating, right? You're gonna have to see this actually come out in the way we teach, the way we engage. How do we make these changes, not even through the way we research or get through the university, but also in our everyday relationships and the way that we're community with one another?
And to close this out, I'm going to get my colleague, friend, and visiting scholar, Corina Jackson, Professor Corina Jackson, to close this out. Wonderful session, you all. This has been great.
Listen, thank you all. Such heartful thanks to all of you. This has been such a wonderful, wonderful learning experience, learning moment, and gathering. C kind of went there. I was only going to say 5 years, but C went to 200 years, because I'm really interested now that some are finishing. Some of us are been put in lots of years, but some are finishing. Like, what if you could change anything? This is kind of something I've been thinking about. Like, if you could change anything or tell someone who's just starting out, right? What would you say? What would you say?
Can't imagine a better way to close this. I'm going to do that every time I host or facilitate something from now on. I like ending it this way. Keep us hanging, keep us ready for a sequel. We might have to do a part 2, part 3, part 4 to this, and y'all are going to organize it. This has been great. Thank you, everybody, for coming through. Appreciate those y'all that stayed. I know we went a couple minutes over, but this has been a wonderful occasion. So I'm looking forward to seeing how people digest and work with this. And I encourage y'all to spread the word, use this in your classes, give yourselves a day off of lecturing, and just have your students listen to this and, ruminate on it for a little while. All right, you all have a good afternoon.
Thanks.